The Bible Treasury, New Series. N7. A monthly magazine of papers on scriptural subjects. Volume 27, Article 34, 1908 and 1909. Part 9 of 46 Studies. Studies in the Gospel of Mark. By W. J. Hawking. 9. The leper touched and cleansed. And there cometh to him a leper, beseeching him, and kneeling down to him, and saying unto him, If thou wilt, thou canst make me clean. And being moved with compassion, he stretched forth his hand, and touched him, and saith unto him, I will, be thou made clean. And straightway the leprosy departed from him, and he was made clean. And he strictly charged him, and straightway sent him out, and saith unto him, See thou say nothing to any man, but go thy way, show thyself to the priest, and offer for thy cleansing the things which Moses commanded, see note 1, for a testimony unto them. But he went out, see note 2, and began to publish, see note 3, it much, and to spread abroad the matter, insomuch that Jesus could no more openly enter into a city, see note 4, but was without in desert places, and they came to him from every quarter, see note 5, Mark 1 verses 40 to 45, Revised Version. Note 1. What Moses ordained, John Nelson Darby, what Moses enjoined, William Kelly. Note 2. Having gone forth, John Nelson Darby, having gone out, William Kelly. Note 3. Proclaim, John Nelson Darby, William Kelly. Note 4. Into town, William Kelly. Note 5. Every side, John Nelson Darby, everywhere, William Kelly. End of notes. We now approach what may be regarded as a new section in the general scheme of Mark's Gospel. And in this section, the incident of the healed paralytic which immediately follows is coupled with that of the cleansed leper. The change in the subject here will be more readily seen after a brief review of the preceding portions of this first chapter. It has been observed, 1. How this Gospel opens by stating circumstantially the credentials of Jesus Christ, the servant of Jehovah, verses 1 to 13, going on to record, 2. His public announcement of the good news that God's kingdom was at hand, verses 14 and 15, 3. His association of others with him in his ministry, verses 16 to 21, 4. His zealous and active beneficence in Capernaum, and indeed throughout Galilee, among those possessed of evil spirits, and those diseased in body, verses 22 to 39. And the last named account of the service of the Lord on the Sabbath and the first of the week is stated in such terms that it forms a tableau of the coming millennial day with its deliverance from temporal ills, which is connected in the prophecies with the personal presence of Jehovah's servant, and which will be preceded by the casting of Satan into the abyss where he will be bound for 1,000 years, Revelation 20. Now the evangelist passes on to illustrate how the Lord was present to relieve a deeper and more serious human need than any yet mentioned. His Galilean ministry was in the preceding narrative shown to comprise the healing of the sick and the deliverance of those oppressed by the devil. But besides this, the nation was legally and morally defiled, and moreover, sin had wrought such inherent weakness in the people that, unable to come of themselves, they needed to be brought to the feet of the divine healer. Two typical cases, the leper and paralytic, are therefore selected for the exemplification of the perfect suitability of the servant of the Lord to remedy the existing state of physical and spiritual evil among men, the physical being used as a type of the spiritual according to the frequent custom in the Gospels, and in this way illustrating by concrete example the word of the kingdom which Jesus preached. Before proceeding to consider the solemn significance of the former of these two incidents, it may be well to note that in the third Gospel also, the same combination occurs. The healing of the leper and then of the palsied man are there given previous to the account of the call of Levi, Luke 5 verses 12 to 26. In Matthew, however, the historical order, which is evidently that found in Mark and Luke, is not followed, but the events are set in that connection which most vividly portrays the kingship of Jesus. There the healing of the leper is placed after that manifesto of the new order of things in the coming kingdom, commonly known as the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 8 verses 1-4, although in point of time the miracle was wrought previously, as Luke shows. And this miracle is followed in Matthew by the healing of the centurion's servant, and of Peter's wife's mother, the stilling of the tempest and the casting out of the demons which then entered the herd of swine. All these events are named before the cure of the palsied man, Matthew 9 verses 1-8, and are followed by the call of the tax gatherer. Without now considering the significance of this chronological displacement of details, it is sufficient to note that Matthew gives a fuller and more varied array of witnesses to the character of Messiah's coming kingdom than was needful in Mark. Here we have only 2 witnesses cited, whose joint testimony, however, is as valid as that of a more numerous company. The cure of the leper. The evangelist describes the cure of the leper in graphic terms, as is characteristic of him. We are called to behold the afflicted outcast coming to Jesus, not standing afar off like the lepers 10, Luke 17 verse 12, but in his eagerness approaching him of whose great power in the kingdom of pain he had heard. With mute entreaties, the poor sufferer, full of leprosy, as Luke tells us he was, beseeches the Master to exercise his pity and his power. In the intensity of his emotion, he threw himself upon his knees, see note, before the Lord in that attitude which is so significant at once of reverence and dependence. Then the kneeling suppliant framed his petition in the brief words which are recorded without variation by the synoptists, save that Matthew and Luke add the term of address, Lord. He does not say, as the fervor of his actions might lead us to expect he would have said, have mercy on me, or, heal me, cleanse me, but he expresses his conviction that in the person of Jesus of Nazareth there is a resident power adequate to meet even such a desperate case as this. If thou wilt, thou canst cleanse me. The leper's prayer has been criticized, it being alleged that it lacks faith because there is no expressed appeal to the love and mercy of the Lord. We desire, in passing, to record an emphatic protest against human criticism of the leper's prayer or of the prayers of any. Prayer is the transmission of the inner cravings of the spiritual nature of man, whether articulate or not, to his God. Who shall intermeddle in this? Who has a right to censure what is meant for the divine ear? If I am an auditor, I may, if needs be, abstain from adding my amen to the petition. This is permitted me, but further, I dare not go. Am I competent to examine the naked heart of him who? The Greek term is also used by Mark of the young ruler who knelt to Jesus, as did the father of the young demoniac, Matthew 17 verse 14. These were sincere, but not so were the soldiers of the governor, who knelt before him in mockery, Matthew 27 and 29, praise, and to unravel his secret motives. The Lord does this still, as he did of old when he openly condemned the prayer of the hypocritical Pharisee for its insincerity. But the Lord does not condemn this defiled pleader. On the contrary, the appeal instantly calls forth the exercise of those potentialities of the healing mercy abounding in him, though there was more than the mere act of miraculous power. He was moved with compassion, his whole nature, rising above all that was loathsome and repellent, physically and ceremonially, in the leper, was stirred with intense sympathy for the sufferer. Here we see the tender mercy of God, Luke 1 verse 78, exhibited in Jesus, that we may be encouraged to seek and find true consolation in his compassions towards us, which fail not. As King Ahasuerus extended the golden scepter of mercy to his beautiful Queen Esther, so the Lord stretched out the hand of mercy and touched the unlovely leper, contracting no defilement as another would have done, Leviticus 13 verse 46, Numbers 5 verse 2. Then he sent forth his word and healed him, I will, be thou made clean. See note. Note. For the cleansing power of the word of Christ, compare John 15 verse 3, Ephesians 5 verse 26. End of note. What does leprosy illustrate? Leprosy was a common disease in Israel and was brought with them, it has been said, from the bondage of Egypt. Apart from its seriousness as a disease of the body, the law of Moses imposed upon it additional seriousness by the ceremonies of that economy. Other infirmities and diseases receive brief mention only, but the instructions having reference to leprosy occupy a considerable section in the priest's guide book, Leviticus 13 and 14. The priest, acting as the representative of Jehovah in the midst of his people, examined the symptoms of a suspected case, and decided accordingly whether the patient was a leper or not, and if so, condemned him to dwell alone in the place of uncleanness without the camp. The priest only was empowered to decide whether the plague of leprosy was healed in a given case, while a series of ceremonies was prescribed before the healed man could be again acknowledged as one of the congregations of worshippers of Jehovah. It is easy to gather from this exceptional prominence assigned to it that leprosy is figurative of sin, and especially of sin in that aspect of it which causes the sinner to be excluded from the presence of God and from the privileges of relationship with Him. This intimate connection between the moral and physical in this disease is illustrated by the case of Uzziah, king of Judah, who in a spirit of profane bravado usurped the priest's office and went into the temple of Jehovah to burn incense on the golden altar. He was opposed by the priests in his sacrilegious act, and he was smitten of God with leprosy to mark his uncleanness of heart and unfitness for the divine presence. Then Uzziah was wroth, and he had a censer in his hand to burn incense, and while he was wroth with the priests, the leprosy broke forth in his forehead before the priests in the house of Jehovah beside the altar of incense. And Azariah the chief priest, and all the priests, looked upon him, and, behold, he was leprous in his forehead, and they thrust him out quickly from thence, yea, himself hasted also to go out because Jehovah had smitten him. And Uzziah the king was a leper unto the day of his death, and dwelt in a separate house, being a leper, for he was cut off from the house of Jehovah. 2 Chronicles 26 verses 16 to 21. At his death, he was buried in a field adjoining the burial place of kings. The uncleanness of the king's heart was indicated by the leper signs which arose in his body and demonstrated the justice of his exclusion from priestly ministrations, though he was the anointed king of Israel. His very effort to force himself into the presence of the all-pure brought to view his latent uncleanness. Leprosy then is emblematical of man's natural defilement, individually and nationally. And by the cleansing of the Galilean leper, the servant of Jehovah showed that he had come to purify the sinner from his sins, as he would Israel also if the nation would take up the language of penitence, and say, "We are all become as one that is unclean, and all our righteousnesses are as a polluted garment." Isaiah 64 verse 6, Revised Version. Then would Jehovah's prophetic promise to his people be fulfilled, "I will cleanse them from all their iniquity, whereby they have sinned against me, and I will pardon all their iniquities, whereby they have sinned, and whereby they have transgressed against me." Jeremiah 33 verse 8. This will be fulfilled in a day to come, but if Israel had known, even then a fountain was opened to the house of David and to the inhabitants of Jerusalem for sin and for uncleanness. Zechariah 13 verse 1. Legal ceremony to be observed. It was the function of a priest to pronounce a leprous man unclean, and it was also his function to pronounce a man clean when he was cured. The law was inoperative to heal, and only took cognizance of the fact of a man being healed or not. The work of ceremonial restoration only commenced when the cure of the plague had been effected by other means. This is expressly stipulated in the book of Leviticus. "And Jehovah spake unto Moses, saying, This shall be the law of the leper in the day of his cleansing, he shall be brought unto the priest, and the priest shall go forth out of the camp, and the priest shall look, and behold if the plague of leprosy be healed in the leper." Leviticus 14 verses 1 to 3. Clearly, the legal provision only contemplated one in whom divine mercy and power had wrought a cure. The leper whom Jesus cleansed was such a one. And the Lord bade him to observe the rites of the law in this respect. He was to show himself to the priest for a testimony, that the genuine nature of this unusual case of recovery might be attested by the recognized authority in such matters. The priest who declared him unclean was the person most qualified to decide whether he was now really clean or not. To him was he therefore sent by the Lord, who never set aside the law. But there was more involved in this than the release of the cleansed leper from his sanitary and religious restrictions. The man was a living witness to the fact that God, who of old cleansed a hated Syrian, had now cleansed a despised Galilean, and this he had done by his servant, greater than Elisha, but equally ignored by the ruling power. The appointed sacrifices and offerings were to be made so that Jehovah's name might be glorified in the obedience thus rendered to his word by the leper in a day of its neglect and dishonor. For this servant sought not his own glory, but his who sent him, being obedient himself, and impressing on others obedience to constitutional authority. The silence enjoined. There has been much conjecture as to the reasons for the silence imposed upon the man by Jesus, "See thou say nothing to any man." But from the narrative, it will be seen that the leper's mission to the priests was made to appear by the Lord to be one demanding immediate execution. After the healing, Jesus at once sent him off, strictly charging him to say nothing to anyone, but to show himself to the priest, who would then have before him indubitable evidence of the reality of this cure. This injunction the man disregarded, and as soon as he left the Lord began to spread the news in the immediate locality, so that Jesus could no longer go into town, but remained in desert places where persons visited him. "See thou say nothing to any man" may be compared with the Lord's direction to the 70, "Salute no man on the way," Luke 10 verse 4. In matters of urgency, it was necessary to avoid these tedious and elaborate salutations. Elisha gave similar instructions to Gehazi, 2 Kings 4 verse 29. The verb, ekbalo, used of the Lord sending him on the errand, while literally meaning to drive forth, certainly implies urgency and speed. The man was directed to discharge his obligations to the Levitical priesthood before abandoning himself to the selfish joy of announcing his cure to his excitable friends and neighbors. Divine claims were paramount. But the healed leper disregarded both the word of his healer and the express commandments of the law. And there have been those who have sought to justify the act of disobedience as if grace such as the leper had received absolved the recipient from the responsibility of obedience. On the contrary, to obey is better than sacrifice, and he, who told the Delevir Gergesene to go home and tell his friends what the Lord had done, Mark 5 verse 19, had wise reasons for what he said to the leper. Silence is a grace equally with speech when in accordance with the will of the Lord.